Let's start out with a moment of silence for the addict who still suffers. All right, set aside prayer. Dear God, please set aside anything we think we know about ourselves, about our disease, about the big book, the 12 steps, the program, the fellowship, the people in the fellowship, and all spiritual terms, especially you, God, so that we may have an open mind and a new experience with all of these things. Please help us to see the truth. Amen. All right. My name is Justin, and I am an addict. And thanks to my God, the steps, and the fellowship of other addicts, I am sober one day at a time since June 19th, 2015. And for that, I am beyond grateful. Welcome to the RICO 12 speaker meeting. We are an organization whose addictions include alcohol, drugs, lust, and sex, food, and gambling, just to name a few. We come together from all places, faiths, and backgrounds to learn the similarities of addiction and to gain tools and hope from others who are walking a similar path. We invite recovering addicts with at least 1 year sobriety and who are actively working their recovery in their respective fellowships to share their experience, strength, and hope on a live Zoom webinar each Friday at noon Central Time for about 20 to 25 minutes. Then we, the live audience, get the opportunity to ask questions of the speaker for another 20 to 25 minutes. In order to ask questions, please type them in the Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom window if you're here live. And if you're hearing this meeting in recorded podcast form and would like to participate as a live audience member in the future, or if you'd like to even be a guest speaker in a future meeting, please go to www.reco12.com. That's RECO12.com to learn more and to submit your email address there to receive weekly invitations or to submit to become a guest speaker. RICO 12 is a self-supporting service, and we appreciate your support. We gratefully accept contributions to help cover the costs of the Zoom platform, podcast platform, web hosting, and administrative costs. To contribute, you can go to reco12.com/support, or you can click the link to PayPal that I'll have in the chat of the live meeting and also in the show notes of the podcast. When you contribute, please specify the meeting number. This is meeting number 44. Last week's meeting was with Jeremy M, and he spoke on the topic of needing a capital C connection in recovery. If you missed hearing that very powerful meeting or any other meeting that we've done, you can listen to them in podcast form by searching for RICO 12 Speaker Meeting Podcast on virtually any podcast platform that you use. Or you can go to the RICO 12 website and find it under the link podcast. If you find value in RICO 12, please take a moment to go to the podcast platform of your choosing and leave a rating and review. Also, please feel free to share it with any of those in your recovery network that may benefit from it. It helps us work our 12th step by carrying the message of recovery to more addicts who suffer. One more word about our speakers before we introduce today's speaker. When we line up a guest speaker for a meeting, we ask them to seek guidance on what and how to present so that they can reflect the light they have been given. That light will inspire hope, meaning, growth, and worth in each of us, the listening audience. Now let's introduce our guest speaker for today, Robert Pardon, who is elected to give up his anonymity in this meeting. He will be speaking on the importance of taking the 12 steps in order. Now here's a little bit about Robert. Robert Pardon is the Recovery Guy, and you can learn more about him at recoveryguy.org or on his podcast called Recovery Guy. Robert holds a degree in alcohol and drug studies and has been clean and sober since April 25th, 1986. Robert spends the majority of his time assisting others in their pursuit of wellness. Take it away, Robert. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Justin. And just in the brief time that we've had to chat today, it's always nice to know I have a new friend. And that is, that's really the beauty of the program of recovery. And whether it's a church-based through the LDS or, Reformers Unanimous through Evangelical or Celebrate Recovery or 12 Steps at Large, there's two aspects of recovery. And one is the program that we follow and the fellowship that sort of holds us together. Because one of the things I think everyone can agree on, whether you're an alcoholic, a drug addict, compulsive overeater, compulsive gambler, sexaholic, a lustaholic, we all suffer a great degree of loneliness and despair because most of the relationships we have that would be considered normal are unhealthy because we are so unhealthy. And we're liars, we're cheaters, that prevent us from having healthy fellowship or relationships, especially with our significant others, because there's that spiritual connection, that unity that's displaced or disjointed or destroyed as a result of our addiction. And then even the people that we hang out with in the course of our active addiction, we know that if it wasn't for the addiction or the behavioral challenge, that relationship wouldn't exist. So even that isn't real. So every one of us come to recovery relationship starved. And that is why it is so important that the preamble of even Alcoholics Anonymous. Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of men and women who share their experience, strength, and hope with each other that we might solve our common problem. And then it goes on. Justin, if the only thing I would have ever heard was Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship, I would have stayed. Because I was so lonely. I was so isolated. I was so starved of anything that resembled hope and faith and fulfillment that I honestly, Justin, if AA didn't work, I didn't know what I was going to do. Because by this time, it was obvious the alcohol, the drugs, the gambling, the sexual pornography, all of those, I knew none of those worked. And that is why I subsequently went into treatment. And so having the fellowship kept me around when logic said run. and I stayed long enough. Today, and I'm so glad we're going to talk about the steps, because to get anywhere in life, one must take steps, because we can't accomplish anything without forward movement. And one of the things I've learned along the way, and maybe many in the audience can relate to, because of the law of gravity, standing still will eventually mean I move backward. Newton's law of motion states that things that are at rest stay at rest. Things that are in motion stay in motion. And that is the indicator that I must always stay in recovery. So I want everyone out there listening to know, even though, as Justin previously stated, by the grace of God and the fellowship of recovery, I will have 35 years, the 25th of this month. And it's all grace, trust me, because left to my own devices, I drink, I use, I destroy. That's who Robert Pardon is. But with the power of God, as he reveals himself through my approach to recovery, I'm whole, I'm complete, I'm well, becoming more well, or as my friend Tom Bennett would say, weller than the well. So my foundation, and I want everyone to understand that it is 12-step recovery. I am a big book thumper, for which I make no apologies whatsoever. When I came into the program, I originally was introduced to recovery through Gamblers Anonymous back in 1985, in December of 85. And I thought if I could, lived in Las Vegas at the time, and I thought if I could solve the gambling problem, maybe I could cut back on the drinking, right? Because we always want to cut back. We never want to stop. We just want to cut back long enough for the heat to die down, the boss to bring us back to work, the wife to open the door, the parents to say, come on over, right? Or the friends to say, you're not that dangerous, whatever it takes, right? And so I went to Gamblers Anonymous, and that worked for about a minute. But what I found, Justin, was really interesting. It would prove to be interesting as I became restored to sanity. It was interesting because I found myself isolating more in my drinking. When I was gambling in Las Vegas, I lived in Las Vegas from 1980 to 1987, and at the height and the acceleration of my disease, I found myself not gambling, but I wasn't drinking at bars and other areas, casinos and so on and so forth. I mean, in every bar, there's a tabletop 21, video poker machine right in Las Vegas bars. So I'd be in casinos and bars, and gambling would be a part of it because you get those so-called free drinks, right? And understanding there's a price to pay. So I stopped gambling for about a minute, but I started drinking at home more, and I started to become more of an isolated drunk. Well, once you remove the fellowship, what I thought I was fellowship, it accelerated the drinking because I became more lonely. And so finally, on February 9th of 1986, I'd lost my job. I was a room service waiter at the Las Vegas Hilton. I had lost my job. I'd lost another paycheck at Davies Locker. I woke up, and maybe you can relate, Justin, or those in the audience today. Remember those voices we would hear? And there were the voices of everyone we had disappointed along the way. And they were like what I called them the tabernacle choir. And in my head, they were saying, Bobby, 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 what are you doing? And of course, there was always the remorse, there was the guilt, there was the despair, everything associated with disappointing people that you otherwise loved. This particular morning, Justin, and I'll never forget it, it says in the big book that we don't regret the past, nor do we wish to shut the door on it. And this is one area, Justin, I will never shut the door on. That morning of February 9th of 1986, I woke up and I looked in the mirror, and Justin, there were no voices. There was no one asking me what I was doing. And I looked in the mirror and I understood loneliness like I'd never understood it before. And it scared me because what it indicated, Justin, it indicated that I was going to die. Here I was, 32 years old, and I was staring at myself dead. I instantly went out to the living room. My mom and dad were already gone. I'd crashed at their place the previous night. Instantly, I went to the big book, to the yellow pages, and for the first time in my life, I admitted I was an alcoholic because I looked under alcoholism. And Justin, up to that moment, I wouldn't have admitted I was alcoholic if you paid me. But it made perfect sense that day, in that moment, to look up alcoholism. And I dialed and I dialed and I dialed. And finally, I found the Nevada Treatment Center, where they said, if you show up here with $50 and you show up within the hour, we don't care if you have insurance, just show up and we'll talk to you. And I did. I called up my dad, I said, who had been sober for 9 years at the time. And I said, Dad, if I show up with $50, some people will help me. And so my dad came and picked me up. I'd lost my license. I couldn't drive at the time. And so my dad drove me to the Nevada Treatment Center over on Martin Luther King Boulevard in Las Vegas. And that was the beginning of my recovery. I would stick around. And this is why I love the steps and the order so much, Justin, why I'm so glad this is the topic for today. I thought I could treat the 12 steps like a buffet, where I could go in and say, I like some of this and I don't like any of that. And I'm going to eat this now and I'm going to eat that later. And I may eat this in between. I could pick and choose what I wanted to do. And that's how I treated the plan of recovery for my first 71 days. And that worked right up until I relapsed. And by the grace of God and those who taught me, I was able to come back after 5 days. And not everyone does, Justin. And that's the scary thing. You know, we see some people leave the rooms, Justin, and we never see them again because we know To get to the rooms the first time is an unprecedented miracle. To get back is grace that I don't even, and mercy that I don't even understand. Because once you hear truth like we hear in recovery, to deny that takes a whole nother level of denial that it is impossible for many to overcome. So with that, I remembered being in the Rhett Butler Motel for 5 days, trying to recapture that feeling of what I call being an almost. And I couldn't do it. And at the end of day 5, I was convinced I wanted to live. And I was also convinced that I could no longer drink because it didn't work, Justin. It didn't work at this point, and there was no greater evidence that I needed. And so that afternoon, on April 25th at 3 p.m., I walked back into the Turning Point in Las Vegas. The late lunch bunch meeting had already ended. By divine appointment, my sponsor, Max, was still in the room, just waiting for me. He didn't know. I don't even think he knew I was going to show up, but God knew, right? So he had Max where he needed Max to be, and I was going to where I needed to be. And I talked to Max, and Max and I talked about how much I needed the program. And Max taught me how it only matters if I want it. He said, Robert, so many people need this program, but the people who stay sober are the people who want it. And if you need it, you'll treat the program like you previously did. If you want it, you'll do everything I say. I said, Max, what do you want me to do? He said, I want you to get on your knees and we're going to say the 3rd step prayer. And that was April 25th of 1986. And, I've been clean and sober since. Sometimes I wonder, especially in that first year, how I made it. I remember holding onto my chair, thinking I can't leave because if I leave, I'll die. I wouldn't go drink, but I'll probably get hit by a car on my way out of the meeting. But somehow I've made it. And I've been so fortunate. I went back to school. I got my degree in alcohol and drug studies. I became a treatment counselor. I've worked in various modalities of treatment, from dual diagnosis, coexisting disorders, nonviolent first-time drug offenders, social model recovery, medical recovery, you name it. I've had a great opportunity. I was a DUI counselor in California, certified. That was pretty crazy because you talk about people in denial. Talk to a person who gets 3 DUIs. And so the journey has been just fabulous. But the whole step thing, it's so simple because I love to apply practical science and personal application into something that is spiritual, like the steps, right? So the reason the steps are critically important to be done in order, because if not, I will, based on my human nature, take the path of least resistance. It says in step 1 of the 12 and 12, Bill writes, who likes to admit complete defeat? Practically no one. And so therefore, I must do step 1 first, and essentially to perfection. My dear friend Pete the Greek told me the only step I ever needed to do to perfection was step 1. He said, the other steps you can make mistakes on and you'll be okay. But if you ever forget that you're powerless over alcohol and your life has become unmanageable, the likelihood is you will relapse. So that's been my personal position. So you must do step 1 to its fullness, because if you don't, Justin, why in the hell would you want to do step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5? If I'm not fully conceded to my innermost self that I'm alcoholic or lustaholic or compulsive gambler or ad infinitum, why would I do the rest of the work? So I must do step 1, just like a ladder. How many times have you seen a person who thought it was practically safe to start on the ladder at rung 2 or 3? You wouldn't do that. Why? Because it's not safe and it's not within our body flow. These ladders are specifically designed with a separation between each rung to be stepped up in order. So when we look at a ladder, I would never, if I'm traveling from Salt Lake City down to and I'm driving and I'm going down to Spanish Fork about 60 miles south of me, I have to pass through certain cities before I get to my destination. It's not an option if I'm going to drive, if I'm going to walk. Even if I fly, I pass over those areas. So when you look at geography, when you look at nature, when you look at anything, even a tree that grows, you've never seen a fully grown tree that didn't start out with the seed. It just doesn't happen. There's seed, there's germination, there's pollination, there's everything that has to occur for that tree to grow. The steps are the same way, right? It says, we thought we could find an easier, softer way, but we could not. With all the earnestness at our command, we beg of you to be fearless and thorough from the very start, right? Some of us have tried to hold on to our old ideas, and the result was nil until we let go absolutely. Me letting go says, whatever you say, man. If you want me to do step 2 after step 1, I'm in. Because I'm fully convinced if I don't do that, Justin, I will relapse. And for a person like me, to relapse is to die. Until I view my addiction as a loaded 357 that will kill me instantly, the only difference between me blowing my brains up with the 357 and drinking is it might take me a couple weeks longer to die from drinking, but dead I will be, right? So I need to do the steps. So when and one of the great things about the steps, and I as a relapse prevention specialist, I deal with a lot of people who have been clean and sober in that 2 to 5 year window, but have relapsed. And what I do with them is I walk back and say, okay, where did the struggle begin? Because invariably, if we walk the steps back, we can usually isolate. Did you not believe that you could be restored to sanity? Did you not fully turn your will and your life over to the care of God as you understood him? How searching and fearless were you really? You know, one of the things I loved about what you chatted with Jeremy last week, by the way, if you're listening, go listen to the Jeremy podcast. It's exceptional. One of the things you talked about was you're only as sick as your secrets. One of the things that you had mentioned. And that's really what happens in step 5, right? Where we admit to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Then I need to come into agreement with defects of character and shortcomings. You know what a defective character and shortcoming is? You'll love this. A defective character is I have a flat tire. A shortcoming is I don't have a spare. And so I work on the defective characters. And as the defective characters are revealed, then I look at the shortcomings whereby I need the power of God and others to fill in the gap where I'm missing, right? And then, of course, we step back into accountability mode in step 8. If I'm not fully convinced in step 4, trusting in step 3, admitting in step 5, understanding defects in step 7 or 6, and shortcomings in step 7, why in the world would I be willing to make a list of all persons I had harmed and become willing to make amends? So I wouldn't do it. I would shortchange that list because I would be denying a defect. I would be denying part of my fearless and moral inventory. I'd be omitting those things that I would painfully have to admit. That's why you can't leave it up to me, because I will always choose the path of least resistance. That's in my human nature, right? So then once I have that, then, and the beauty of the program of recovery is in step 8, I've made a list of all persons I had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. The majority of people in my immediate life, by the time I get to step 8, they're already accepting amends, because really all they wanted me is to become well. All they wanted me is to become back and part of the family, right? So the most important and spiritual and interpersonal relationships in my life are already migrating back, some cautiously and well they are, but they're starting to come back. So when I get to step 9, which if I don't do a step 8, there's nothing for step 9 to do. Just like if there's no step 4, what are you going to admit in step 5? So you see the interconnection and the reason why they are in order. I would never consider trusting God and then jumping right into step 8, because what am I going to tell him? I need step 4 and step 6 and step 7 to understand the fullness of step 8. So I go through step 8, I get the foundation for step 9, right? And then I make direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. And this is really important for everyone to understand, especially still me, that we want guidance through these things. So if you don't have a priest, a rabbi, an imam, a pastor, a mentor, a recovery sponsor, get one. Do not try to attempt to do these steps by yourself, because very often I would get stuck in a step and I needed to go to my sponsor, who would share his experience, strength, and hope with me, how he got through that particular blockage to completely and successfully do that step. Then once I get to step 9, here's what's great. According to the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it says, for by this time, it's step 9, for this time, sanity will have been restored. That's what it says. If you have a problem with that, your problem is not me, because I'm quoting the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. I want to make that very clear. So send your emails to, right? New York, New York. So then once I get set for that, here's where it gets really exciting. I've already launched into the spiritual realm. I've catapulted into a spiritual dimension, the domain of the spirit. And now I can safely live steps 10, 11, and 12. I am of the school, Justin, that I never have to go back, unless I'm working with the newcomer, I never have to go back and do steps 1 through 9. And here's why. What is the first word in step 10? It's continued. Continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admit it. So that means that all the previous steps, I need to continue. If I'm continuing something, why do I have to go back? So within step 10 embodies all of the previous steps. I continue to take a personal inventory. When I'm wrong, promptly admit it. It has a daily, a spot check, an annual, and a semi-annual house cleaning. So I don't need to do step 4. I do step 10 on a regular basis. That's what I've been taught, right? Why go backward when you can go forward? And so this is about going forward for me, and it's what I teach. So then I launch from step 10. It gives me the energy, the excitement, the clean slate, Justin, to jump into step 11, where I sought through prayer and meditation to improve my conscious contact with God as we understood God, praying only for the knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. And then, of course, I go into step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. So embodied in step 12 is steps 1 through 11. Isn't that a beautiful thing? On page 85 of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it says, what I really have is a daily reprieve contingent on the maintenance of my spiritual condition. And then after that, it says, what I really need to do is find out God's vision for me and then go do it. That's steps 10, 11, and 12, embodied in that paragraph of page 85. And that is my approach to the steps. That is much of my personal history. Obviously, there's more, but my middle name is More, right? So there's always going to be more. But I think that takes us to our 25 minutes. And thank you for the platform to share. Obviously, I have energy. I'm so passionate about recovery, because this life I've been given, Justin, is so much more than I ever deserved. I could not have dreamed this life. And when I meet newcomers in the room, or I go to speaking, or I work with a new coaching client, I want them to find what I find. You know, if you want what we have and are willing to go to any lengths to get it, then you are ready to take certain steps. That's why I'm such a believer, because without the steps, Justin, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Awesome. Robert, that was really, really good. Your description of defects of character and shortcomings just blew my mind. I've got to do a lot of thinking on that. And I think I'll ask a question about that to dig a little bit deeper when we get into the Q&A. But before we get into the Q&A, and a reminder to our live audience, please type your questions in the little Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom window. Looks like two speech bubbles over the top of each other. And we'll get to those here in a minute. But before we get there, Robert, can you please take just a minute and explain how the fellowship helps you today, the fellowship that you choose to attend, AA, and how that helps you today?
Great question. And because the fellowship is so vital, we are social creatures. It is not good that man should be alone, right? We are social. It's stamped in our DNA is not only our need for others, but because I believe I am my brother's keeper, I need to feed as well as be fed. And that requires you and others like you. So when I walk into the rooms of recovery, regardless of where I'm at, and maybe you've experienced this as well, I'm home. I could be in Springfield, Missouri, and all I have to say is, my name is Robert. I'm a happy, grateful, recovered alcoholic. And it's like all my brothers and sisters showed up just to see me. And that's the magic. And I love magic when it comes to God and his provision. God has ordained and resides over the rooms of recovery. And he's empowered each of us to make the most lonely and scared person that we were and make them feel at home. I remember, Justin, and I'll never forget this, the first time I walked into a room of Alcoholics Anonymous and realized how much I belonged. And the warmth and just the feeling, when you're lost, as long as we're lost, Justin, coming home for the first time is something that you want over and over again. And so I go back and I enjoy the fellowship. The fellowship isn't recovery. The fellowship is the emotional fulfillment of the recovery.
Thank you. I love that last, I loved it all, but that last phrase, the fellowship is not recovery, but it is the emotional fulfillment of recovery. What a beautiful way to put that. All right. We've had a few questions come in, and I'm sure we'll have more. And I've got a couple lined up here also. But our first question for you, Robert, is from one of our live audience members. Says, I love your story. I love your share. So many gems. How long did it take you to fully complete the 12 steps? And when you help people, how do you know if they are moving too slowly?
Great question. Who's the name of the questioner?
Came across as an anonymous attendee. So that one.
Hello, anonymous attendee.
Yes.
We will call you AA. That's pretty good. Yeah. So, I remember really starting the steps when I was about 9 months sober. I had done step 1. That's the only reason I was able to stay. So at about 9 months, I was tired of the pain of not doing the steps. And I would see other people around me achieving things I knew I was capable of achieving. And the common denominator was they were working the steps, I wasn't. So I began at about 9 months of really being thorough. That's longer than most people. That's why I say I have no idea why I stayed sober the first year. But it probably took me 3 months, right about when I took my 1-year chip. I honestly say I had worked all 12 steps and began going back over them just to make sure, before I was introduced to the concept of steps 10, 11, and 12, I continued to go back, kind of like that buffet thing. Now that I had done them in order, I can go back to the buffet and eat what I liked, right? And so I would be uncovering, because one of the things that we do as we experience clarity, spiritual, mental, emotional clarity, we want to fill in some blanks. And so this is where, and I think the second part of your question is really valid as well. This is where good sponsorship and mentorship really comes into play. And you always want a person that has worked the steps and is exhibiting recovery as it's defined in the big book. Don't take your advice for it because you might still be jacked up. So look in the big book. If they match what the big book is saying about happy, joyous, and free, we're not a glum lot. They have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. They believe they can go anywhere and do anything. Those are the characteristics you want to look for. Judge them by the criteria that you want to live by. If they are consistent, use them. If they're not, treat them as a friend and as a confidant. So let them be the reason, that push you forward and to get you off your dime and to continue to accelerate. Some of us come in sicker than others. And so every individual has to determine that for themselves. And I wish there was more of a definitive answer. But here's the deal. When you're half stepping. I knew. I didn't always admit it, but I knew when I was taking longer in something I should have already done. And I hope that addresses your question.
Thank you so much, Robert. I appreciate that. Have another question from Jacqueline from our live audience. She says, I'm stuck on my 4th step. Any tips?
The 4th step is a list. It can't hurt you. The 12 and 12 really lays out, the 12 and 12 of Alcoholics Anonymous really lays out a great blueprint. The big book does, but you have to remember that the 12 and 12 was written and published about 16, 17 years after the original big book was published. So the founders and Bill had great experience in how the step works. So do your 4th step with the 12 and 12. Know that it's only a list, right? If you're having if it's an emotional or spiritual problem, look at step 3. Because if we made a decision to turn our will and our life over to the care of God as we understood him, the likelihood is we're not doing things in the flesh because flesh will scare me. The spirit realm doesn't, because God is doing for me what I could not do for myself. And I hope that addresses, but again, it's a list. Be as thorough as you can be in the moment and trust in God and know that a list can't hurt you.
I love that. And I'm going to harken back to something you said in your first portion of this. You said the only step that needs to be done perfectly is step 1. And I know that I got hung up on my step 4 a little bit, thinking I have to be absolutely perfect in this. Yes, I need to be searching and thorough, but I've got step 10 to do for the rest of my life if something comes back. I don't need to worry about every single thing at this point if it's not there. So
exactly, because you know what? It says in the big book that we're no longer able to differentiate the true from the false. Sometimes that clarity, I'll tell you, Justin, there were some stories that I told that in year 2 and 3 and 4, I was wondering if they were really true. And so there are some things that might not come to me. That's one of the reasons. Thank you for reiterating step 10. That's why it says continue to take personal inventory. So I never really stopped step 4. I just elevate it to another position.
Very good. Thank you. All right. Another anonymous attendee, another AA, asks, have you completed all of your amends? And if so, I'm wondering how long it took you to complete those amends.
Wow, that is profound. Thank you for that question. Some amends I'm continuing to do because I did so much damage to some people, specifically my 2 oldest daughters, who I walked out on. And, I don't know if I need to continue to make amends as much as I want to continue to demonstrate the change that has occurred in me. Some things, and part of it's my guilt and shame that can take a lifetime to get over. But we just continue to work. And it's not to say I keep saying I'm sorry, right? But I keep demonstrating who I am now. I don't go back and say, I'm sorry what I did to you at 6. I'm sorry what I did to you. We do that, but I want to create more evidence of that sorrow. It's kind of like the word love. Love is a verb, not a noun. And so is amends. Amends is a noun that we continue to live. We continue to demonstrate. Fortunately for me, my 2 oldest daughters, Kathleen and Carol, they're so gracious and so forgiving in their relationship with me. However, my oldest daughter said to me about 8 years ago in her driveway when I went to visit her, she said, Dad, our relationship may never get better than it is now. So if this is good for you, we can have this. If not, I can't help you. And it broke my heart as a dad because I was reminded 27 years in my sobriety, the harm that I had done while I was still in my addiction. And, I didn't go back. I didn't revert. I didn't do woe is me. I just said, I need to further demonstrate to her who I am today. And so that is my amends. Continue to do the things that we know we need to do and allow them, because I can only control one side of it, Justin, and our anonymous asker. I can only live out this life that I'm living. It's up to the other person to receive and accept to their own spiritual growth or position. I can't control that. I know that every night when I lay down my head and I've done my 10th step, I know that I was the best person possible. And if I wasn't, I know to address that the first thing in the morning. And that's all I'm capable of doing.
Very good. Thank you. We have another question from one of our live audience members. Thomas asks this: how do you impress upon those you sponsor that relapse is death, as you explained it? And how do you respond when your sponsees relapse?
Wow. Relapse is so devastating. It's such a terrible defeat. Love and tolerance is our code, man. I embrace them. I treat them the way Max treated me, without judgment, putting God before himself and letting me reconcile with that. I don't let people that I work with off of step 1 until they can articulate to me. Because I work with a lot of people in treatment centers, and the whole COVID thing has sort of jacked that up, but I go to treatment centers a lot, and treatment centers in Southern California, my friend Scotty runs Welcome Home Sober Living, and I get down there when possible, and I go into prisons and institutions. And I make sure that they understand their hopelessness to the best of my ability. And then if they relapse, I own some of that, though at the end of the day, they will have to. So I treat them with love and tolerance and patience. Because I know some people, one of the guys that I've sponsored, he's 7.5 years, almost 8 years of recovery now. I met him in a treatment center down in Payson, Utah called Steps. And Chris T was in treatment 11 different places before recovery took hold. And you know what he does today? He goes and he emulates what I do because of how I treated him every time he relapsed. I know, again, Justin, as we had previously said, when you leave, it's more than likely you're not coming back. And I grieve because I know what that loneliness and despair is like.
That's one of the questions I had for you that I'm going to pose right now. You mentioned that, and I hadn't thought about this quite this way before. When somebody comes into the rooms, gets a little bit of sobriety under their belt, and then goes back out, whether initially it's because I feel like I've got this, I'm healed, I'm good, I can move on, or whether it's I have relapsed and gone back out. And then eventually, if the person who says, I've got this, I'm healed, I'm good, relapses, coming back in, that stigma's, that shame attached to that is massive. So how do you have any words for the person who is out there right now in that place, who is hearing this and going, man, I'm so ashamed, I can't go back into the rooms, I can't do this again? Do you have any words of encouragement to invite them back by chance?
Come home. We miss you more than we could express. We know your loneliness. We know your pain. Let us love you. Come back and share the hug, because we won't judge you nearly as harshly as you're judging yourself right now. It's not who we are. We want you to come back. Like any parent wishes their child will come home. We're family. We are a fellowship of men and women who share.
Amen. All right. So we have a clarification that comes in from one of the who was previously identified in here as an anonymous attendee. His name is Yitzi, and he says, I'm Yitzi in New York. I asked the previous question about amends. I meant to ask if you made every last approach and did your utmost to clean up your past. I have a clear list and I'm slowly moving through them. And obviously there's resistance, especially after being sober for a bit and the main harms were cleared up. So any other thoughts on that, Robert?
Yeah. Yitzi, thank you so much for opening up your anonymity. That's always courageous. As Justin previously stated, my name is Robert Pardon. I have no anonymity. And rightfully so. I want you to be able to find me. And that's one of the reasons that Scott Shields, who just celebrated 37 years, one of my mentors early on, will say, I said, Scotty, why do you say your last name? Isn't this anonymity? It's Scotty S, right? Robert P. And he said, bro, there could be a number of Scott S's. What if I'm in the hospital? What if you need to reach me? I want you to know how you can find me. So I adopted that as well. So Yitzi, here's the deal. I only own the amends. I don't own the receipt of it. And that's what I have to separate. Make direct amends to such people wherever possible. Some people don't want the amends. Some people need more time. I had family members, Yitzi, who would not even answer the call until I was a year and a half, 2 years sober. They wouldn't even recognize me because I had done so much damage over time. I can't do anything about that. I have to learn how to be happy, joyous, and free as I am honest, open-minded, and willing. And let God do for me what I couldn't do for myself. I can't mandate that a person receive my amends, but I can pray to God to soften their heart, to see me as I'm desiring and actively living to be seen. That's all I own. That's all I can control.
Thank you very much. I have one more question. If anybody else in the live audience has another question, we've got a couple minutes to wrap up. But the last question that I have for you, Robert, I loved a couple of things you said, but I'm going to go to the defect of character and the shortcoming analogy you made of the defect of character is me having a flat tire, and the shortcoming is me not having a spare tire to replace that flat tire with. How would one go about making sure that I have a spare tire in order to replace that flat tire when it manifests itself?
Great question. And it took me a few years just to get my head around it. At first, it was just kind of a pretty cool cliche, and I could relate to a degree. So the principles and the guidelines. See, what's important, as a matter of fact, a podcast from Tuesday's podcast was on the 12 principles. So the shortcomings, shoring up the shortcomings, are hope and tolerance and all the attributes that a recovered person has that prevents them from going back to being the person that we were. And so as I work through the program and I develop a greater degree of love and compassion and hope and care and honesty, all those things. And I begin getting involved in service, and I understand unity to another level. These are the things that will strengthen me to almost make me bulletproof. In the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it talks about permanent recovery. I believe I have achieved that, but the way I've achieved it is by staying, like today is 12,767 days for me, right? Which is even more impressive than 35 years, right? Because it's like, wow, that many times in a row. Because, we're people who would swear up at 9 o'clock at night and be hammered by noon the next day, right? So 24 hours is like, are you kidding me? I can't go 12, right? And all of a sudden we're putting all this time together. So I think a lot of it is just an accumulation of attributes and qualities. That's why we need to still keep digging. And we sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood God, praying only for the knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. And as we say certain prayers, like the 3rd step prayer, the 11th step prayer that you did with Jeremy last week, it's a way, where there is doubt, let me sow this, and where there is hatred, let me sow love, and where there is this, let me sow that. It's almost like a Proverbs approach, a compare and contrast. This is who I was, this is who I need to be. And it's what I call the exchange theory of recovery. It's something I've developed over the years. So if I want to not live in darkness, I just have to learn how to introduce light. Right? And that's what we do. Once we find out what our defects of character are, we introduce we introduce in shortcomings, we introduce attributes that push them out as they introduce new things in. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. And I'm like you said, it took you a couple of years to process that and see that. When you shared that with me, it just kind of blew my mind a little bit, and I'm going to take some time processing that. But thank you for your help in getting me started on that.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah.
Very good. So before we go into our closing reading and launch off into the day with the Serenity Prayer, do you have any final words of wisdom or invitations for us, the listening audience?
I'm going to share. I was sharing this with Elise the other day from Sober Pop and Clubhouse. And I'm going to share with you what my sponsor, Jack, told me. Jack passed away of cancer a little more than 2 years ago with 44 years of personal recovery. And I sat in his bed, and me and this person named Richard, who just celebrated 35 years, April 2nd, we're just a few weeks apart. We were his longest sober sponsees. So I sat in his hospital bed in Las Vegas, and I got real close because he could hardly talk, and I wanted him to pass me the mantle because when I left, I would not see him alive anymore. So I said, Jack, what do I tell him? What's your message that you want me to share? And he looked at me with his sunken cancer eyes and his barely audible sound. And he said, Bob, tell him it works. And I kissed him and I hugged him and I walked out of the room, and 2 days later he would be dead. Sober 44 years, and what a legacy. So that's my message, Justin. It works.
I love it. Thank you so much, Robert. That was a fantastic RICO 12 weekly speaker meeting for all addicts and those wanting to learn more about addiction and the recovery therefrom. If you in the live audience had additional questions, or if you have would like to discuss any of these points, you can go to rico12.com/forum and join in our community and ask those questions and answer other questions that will come up. I invite the audience to come back next week. If you've not yet gone to rico12.com and submitted your email address, please get on the invitation list so you can join us live at each Friday at noon Central Time. Next week, we're going to hear from John S., and I'm super excited about that. All right, Robert has elected to have us launch off into the rest of our day with the Serenity Prayer, and he will be voice. Have at it, Robert.
Let's pray. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. Keep coming back, everybody. It works if you work it. So work it. You are worth it.
Standing still a moment, carving out this time, reflecting on the landscape of this life of mine. Peaks too high to conquer, streams too wide to cross, troughs too deep to walk through without incurring loss. Yet here I am, still standing tall, despite the rough terrain. One like me survived the storm.